In the basement of Stanford University's psychology building in August 1971, something went terribly wrong. What started as a 2-week experiment to study prison behavior lasted only 6 days. By the time it ended, young men were crying uncontrollably. Guards were forcing prisoners to simulate sexual acts, and the lead researcher had become so consumed by his role that his girlfriend had to scream at him to make him see what was happening. For decades, this experiment has been held up as proof that good people can turn evil in the right situation. But what if almost everything we were told about it was wrong? But before we get into today's story, if you enjoy detailed explorations of controversial psychological experiments and mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew, then you're in the right place. Because that's exactly what we cover here. And I post new stories 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, please gently tap the like button and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which takes place at Stanford University in California in August 1971. Philip Zimbardo was 38 years old and an ambitious psychology professor at one of America's most prestigious universities. He'd recently joined Stanford's faculty in 1968, and by the summer of 1971, he was looking to make his mark. Zimbardo was interested in how situations could transform human behavior, particularly in prisons. He believed that the brutal conditions in American prisons weren't caused by naturally violent people, but by the prison environment itself. To prove this theory, he designed an experiment that would become one of the most famous psychological studies in history. The setup was deceptively simple. Zimbardo placed advertisements in 2 local newspapers, the Palo Alto Times and the Stanford Daily. The ad read, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks beginning August. 14 inches. In 1971, $15 a day was decent money for a college student, equivalent to about $116 today. Within days, 75 young men had responded to the advertisement. Zimbardo and his team carefully screened every applicant. They conducted diagnostic interviews and personality tests specifically designed to weed out anyone with psychological issues, medical problems, or any history of crime or drug abuse. They wanted the most normal, stable, healthy young men they could find. After all the screening, they selected 24 participants. These were predominantly white, middle-class college students who were deemed psychologically stable and mature. They were, by every measure, good kids. On August 14, 1971, 12 of these young men were randomly assigned to be prisoners, and 12 were assigned to be guards. None of them knew each other beforehand. The basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall Psychology Building had been transformed into a makeshift prison, complete with cells created from converted laboratory rooms, a closet repurposed as solitary confinement, and a small yard area. Guards received uniforms, including mirrored sunglasses that prevented eye contact and dehumanized their appearance. Prisoners would wear smocks with identification numbers and would be referred to only by those numbers, never by name. But here's where things start to get interesting. The day before the experiment began, Zimbardo held an orientation session for the guards. During this meeting, which was captured on tape, Zimbardo gave very specific instructions. He told the guards they could create feelings of boredom and fear in the prisoners. He told them to create a sense that the prisoners' lives were totally controlled by the system. He told them to take away the prisoners' individuality. And most importantly, he told them, "We're going to take away their individuality in various ways." In general, what all this leads to is a sense of powerlessness. On Sunday morning, August 15, 1971, the experiment officially began in dramatic fashion. Real Palo Alto police officers arrived at the homes of the young men assigned as prisoners. These college students were arrested without warning, charged with armed robbery and burglary, handcuffed, put in squad cars with sirens wailing, and driven to the police station. Surprised neighbors watched from their yards. The prisoners were fingerprinted, photographed, and processed exactly like real criminals. Then they were blindfolded and transported to Stanford's basement prison. For the first day, Zimbardo later admitted, nothing much happened. The guards felt awkward in their uniforms. They had an anti-authority mentality. Some of them just wanted to play cards in their office and collect their paycheck. But on the second day, everything changed. The prisoners in Cell 1 staged a rebellion. They barricaded their cell door with their beds and taunted the guards. The guards, feeling their authority challenged, responded with force. They got fire extinguishers and sprayed the prisoners with carbon dioxide until they backed away from the doors. They stripped the prisoners naked. They took away their beds. They started using the closet for solitary confinement, which they now called the hole. And they divided the prisoners into good and bad groups, giving privileges to some and harsh treatment to others to break their solidarity. Keep this detail in mind because it becomes crucial later. One of the guards, a 22-year-old student named David Jaffe, was assigned to be the warden. What almost nobody knew at the time was that 3 months earlier, in May 1971, Jaffe had designed and conducted his own prison experiment as a class project in one of Zimbardo's courses. That earlier experiment, conducted in Stanford's Toyon Hall dormitory, served as a blueprint for what was about to unfold. But let's get back to the basement. By Tuesday, August 17th, just 36 hours into the experiment, something shocking happened. Prisoner 8612, a 22-year-old Berkeley graduate named Douglas Korpi, was locked in the hole. Suddenly, the researchers heard him screaming. The audio tape captured his anguished voice. "I'm burning up inside. Don't you know? I can't stay in there. And I want out. And I want out now." It sounded like a complete psychological breakdown. Zimbardo, concerned about Korpi's mental state, went to talk to him. But here's the strange part. When Korpi asked to leave, Zimbardo told him he couldn't quit because they were making history and Korpi was the leader of the rebellion. Eventually, though, Zimbardo did release him. To maintain the illusion for the other prisoners, he told them that prisoner 8612 had been transferred to a maximum security facility. Over the next few days, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Guards forced prisoners to do push-ups, sometimes placing their boots on the prisoners' backs. They made them clean toilet bowls with their bare hands. They woke them up in the middle of the night for counts that could last hours. They forced prisoners to wear bags over their heads. On Thursday, August 19th, another prisoner called 819 began showing severe signs of distress, crying uncontrollably in his cell. When a priest who had been brought in to interview the prisoners spoke with him, the young man kept saying he couldn't leave because the other prisoners thought he was bad. Zimbardo had to reassure him that his name wasn't 819, that this wasn't a real prison, that he could go home. By this point, Zimbardo himself had become completely immersed in his role as prison superintendent. He wasn't thinking like a researcher anymore. He was thinking like someone running an actual prison. On Thursday night, his colleague Gordon Bauer visited and asked him a simple question. "What's the independent variable in this study?" Zimbardo couldn't answer. He'd lost sight of the science entirely. That same evening, something happened that would finally end the experiment. Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD in psychology who Zimbardo was dating at the time, came to the prison to conduct interviews with the participants. She was the first outsider to truly observe what was happening. What she saw made her sick. Prisoners were chained together, wearing bags over their heads, shuffling down the hallway while guards shouted orders at them. When she went back upstairs, she and Zimbardo had a massive fight outside the building. She screamed at him, "It's terrible what you are doing to those boys." She told him she didn't recognize the person he'd become and didn't want to continue their relationship if he couldn't see what was happening. It was like she'd snapped him out of a trance. When Zimbardo returned to the basement that night, he found guards forcing prisoners to simulate sexual acts with each other, shouting commands like, "You're male camels, stand behind the female camels and hump them." The next morning, Friday, August the 20th, he terminated the experiment. The planned 2-week study had lasted just 6 days. In the immediate aftermath, Zimbardo's interpretation of what happened seemed straightforward and deeply troubling. Normal, healthy young men had been transformed by their roles and the prison environment. Guards had spontaneously become sadistic. Prisoners had become submissive and broken. The situation, not the people, had caused the cruelty. This became known as situationism, the idea that circumstances, more than personality, drive human behavior. The timing of the announcement was perfect. Just 1 day after the Stanford Prison Experiment ended, a major prison riot erupted at San Quentin. 3 weeks later, the Attica prison uprising in New York dominated headlines nationwide, ending in a bloody confrontation ordered by Governor Nelson Rockefeller that killed guards and prisoners alike. Suddenly, everyone wanted to understand why prisons were such violent places. Zimbardo's experiment seemed to provide the answer. He testified before Congress. He wrote papers and eventually a best-selling book called The Lucifer Effect. The experiment became a staple of psychology textbooks, cited as proof that anyone could become evil in the right circumstances. For decades, that's where the story ended. The Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most famous studies in psychology, referenced in countless textbooks, turned into movies, and used to explain everything from Abu Ghraib prisoner abuse to corporate misconduct. Zimbardo became one of the most recognizable psychologists in the world. He married Christina Maslach, the woman who convinced him to end the study. He spent his entire career promoting the lessons of his experiment. When he died in October 2024 at age 91, his obituaries led with the Stanford Prison Experiment. But here's where it gets really strange. In 2014, a French researcher named Thibault Le Texier started digging into the experiment's archives. What he found would challenge everything we thought we knew. Le Texier spent years going through 16 boxes of documents at Stanford University and another box at the Archives of the History of American Psychology at the University of Akron. He analyzed hundreds of paper documents, 6 hours of film recordings, and 48 hours of audio recordings made during, before, and after the experiment. He also tracked down and interviewed 15 of the original participants. What Le Texier discovered was shocking. First, he found evidence that the guards had received far more specific instructions than anyone had previously known. The guards weren't just told to maintain order. They were coached on exactly how to behave to create the harsh prison environment. Second, he discovered that Zimbardo had essentially written his conclusions before the experiment even began. The study wasn't designed to discover what would happen, but to confirm what Zimbardo already believed. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Le Texier found that the guards were never told they were also subjects in the experiment. They thought they were research assistants, helping Zimbardo prove his theory. They were trying to give him the results he wanted. Around the same time, journalist Ben Bloom started conducting his own investigation. He managed to track down several of the original participants and interview them directly, bypassing Zimbardo's controlled narrative. What they told him was remarkable. David Eschliman, the most notoriously cruel guard, admitted that he'd based his entire persona on a character from the movie Cool Hand Luke. He was a theater student, and he saw the experiment as a performance. He wanted to help Zimbardo get dramatic results. "I took it as a kind of an improv exercise," Eschliman told Bloom. He knew exactly what he was doing, and it wasn't a spontaneous transformation. But the biggest revelation came from Douglas Korpi, prisoner 8612, the young man whose anguished screaming had become the most famous moment of the entire experiment. In a 2017 interview, Korpi admitted something stunning. He'd been faking the breakdown. He'd taken the job because he thought he'd have time to sit in a cell and study for his graduate record examinations, which were scheduled right after the experiment ended. When guards wouldn't give him his books, he tried faking a stomachache to get released. When that didn't work, he faked a psychological breakdown. "The breakdown I had was a manipulation to get out of the damn experiment," Korpi told Bloom. "Anybody who is a clinician would know that I was faking. If you listen to the tape, it's not subtle. I'm not that good at acting." Zimbardo, of course, rejected these claims. He insisted that Korpi was lying in retrospect because he was ashamed of having broken down. He maintained that the breakdown was real and that he'd been ethically obligated to treat it as real at the time. But the audio tapes tell a more complicated story. When you listen to them with fresh ears, knowing what we know now, they sound less like a psychotic break and more like someone desperately trying to convince their boss to let them quit a terrible job. In August 2019, Le Texier published his findings in The American Psychologist, the journal of the American Psychological Association. His article, titled "Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment," laid out 7 major criticisms supported by archival evidence. The data collection had been biased and incomplete. Participants were never completely immersed in the situation as claimed. The experiment had drawn heavily on Jaff's earlier student project without proper disclosure. Most damningly, the guards had been given precise instructions and weren't told they were subjects. They were essentially following a script. Other researchers piled on. Psychologists pointed out that the experiment suffered from severe selection bias, since the advertisement specifically mentioned prison life, which might have attracted people already predisposed to aggression or authoritarianism. Critics noted that Zimbardo had violated scientific protocol by releasing his findings through press releases and the New York Times before publishing in peer-reviewed journals. Multiple attempted replications, including the 2002 BBC prison study, failed to reproduce Zimbardo's results. When researchers created similar situations without coaching the participants, guards didn't become cruel on their own. In November 2024, National Geographic released a 3-part documentary series called The Stanford Prison Experiment: Unlocking the Truth. It featured new interviews with participants, clips from the original experiment, and conversations with Le Texier and other critics. Many of the original participants confirmed Le Texier's findings. The documentary revealed that only a fraction of the original experiment had actually been filmed, and much of what people think they remember seeing was actually reenacted later or described in Zimbardo's dramatic retellings. The controversy has forced a major reckoning in psychology. Many textbooks still include the Stanford Prison Experiment as a landmark study, but a growing number are adding critical context or removing it entirely. Some researchers have called for it to be formally retracted. The American Psychological Association, which published Le Texier's debunking article in its own journal, has not taken that step. In 1973, an APA investigation concluded the prison study had satisfied existing ethical standards, but those standards were revised shortly after specifically to prohibit experiments like this one. Zimbardo himself noted that no behavioral research putting people in that kind of setting can ever be done again in America. So what really happened in the basement of Stanford's psychology building in August 1971? The answer seems to be something much more complex and much more human than Zimbardo's original interpretation. Yes, some guards were cruel, but they were explicitly told to be cruel by a researcher they trusted. Yes, some prisoners had breakdowns, but at least one was faking to escape what he described as a really bad job. Yes, the situation became harmful and abusive, but not because normal people spontaneously turned evil. It happened because a charismatic authority figure created an environment designed to produce those exact results, and then lost control of his own creation. The real lesson of the Stanford Prison Experiment might not be about how situations corrupt good people. It might be about how authority figures can manipulate people into behaving badly when those people believe they're serving a greater purpose. It might be about how we construct narratives to fit our beliefs rather than following where the evidence leads. It might be about how a single flawed study can dominate our understanding for 50 years, simply because it tells a compelling story that confirms what we want to believe about human nature. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains one of the most thoroughly documented and hotly debated studies in psychology history. Whether you believe Zimbardo's interpretation or the mounting evidence from critics like Le Texier and Bloom, one thing is undeniable. The experiment itself was real. People were genuinely harmed, and its influence on how we think about prisons, power, and human behavior has been enormous. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, I've got another controversial psychological experiment you need to see. Click the video on your screen right now about the Milgram obedience experiments and how they were also manipulated. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories like this. Thanks for watching. Until next time. See ya.